My presentation will deal with the current situation in the Egyptian labor market, and only tangentially I can say something about, I can speculate what will happen because of the fourth industrial revolution in Egypt and in the region. So I'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. But I thought that the best way I can contribute to the debate at this conference is to present some of my own results from my joint research with Shireen Al-Azawi, who I've written a couple of studies with, and so I'll present hopefully some of the interesting results about vulnerable workers, so vulnerable youth workers in Egypt, female labor force participation rate, and maybe something about the role of migration in the region. How does Beamer work? Oops, no? No?
The side arrow, yeah.
Very short click.
Can I put a light? Is there a light? The light doesn't work? It's fine. That's okay. I'll make do without light. And so the backdrop of my presentation is that there are various structural problems in the Egyptian labor market. I will not get into it, and I hope that I don't have to answer any questions about this. But the standard kind of shopping list is that there are these formal and informal firms and formal informal workers. There's duality between them, which makes it hard for workers to switch type of job and for companies to switch their position in the market. We can also point out to the role of the public sector, which we can say crowds out talent. There's this large public sector as an employer. It might be diminishing over time in Egypt, but it still plays a significant role. And we can, I think relevant to this discussion is the role of education, and we've had some debate about that. From my perspective, I think the secondary and tertiary schools do not teach the necessary productive skills, and something new is needed, either some kind of university corporate collaboration, or universities need to restructure to teach the skills that are more needed, especially in the digital economy. I can come back to it at the end of the presentation. Okay. And so I will get into some specific results for the vulnerable employment of Egyptian youth and the fate of women in the labor market, and maybe the role of migration. So so all of these structural problems that I mentioned in the Egyptian economy are hard on youth workers, because youth workers find it hard to get into formal jobs. It's not clear to them how youth workers should be accumulating human capital, whether through formal education or through some other ways. And youth workers have a dilemma whether to seek employment in the public sector or private sector. So all of these structural problems are related to youth. And in one paper that Shireen Al-Azawi and I wrote, we studied social mobility of workers, distinguishing the experience of youth workers against that of older workers. And we did find that youth workers have a particularly hard time transitioning to better forms of employment, better sectors, They have lower odds of becoming employed in any type of employment compared to non-youth, particularly formal employment or as employers. And university graduates, compared to less educated youth workers, have among the highest odds of staying unemployed. Perhaps because they have high expectations of landing good quality jobs, but the jobs are not there, so they spend a lot of time searching for jobs. And I'll show some evidence how that works out. Women have lower odds of joining the labor force, particularly private sector, and there are gender gaps in the odds of employment. And these are large in Egypt, especially even by the standards of the MENA region. And there are some results that point to deteriorating labor market conditions during 1998 and 2012. So I will use, for the most part, the labor market panel surveys for Egypt up to year 2012. So Francesco and Ragi went beyond that, and I hope that I will not repeat too much of their findings, and I will show slightly different perspective than them, I hope. So looking at the job transitions of youth male workers in Egypt between 1998 and 2006 and 1998 and 2012, these graphs show the distribution of jobs, distribution of employment status across 2 years. On the x-axis, we have a different employment status as of 1998, and on the y-axis, we see the distribution of the jobs for these employees as of 2006. So, for example, we see that among youth workers who were in the formal private sector in 1998, by year 2006, 56% of them were still employed in the formal private sector, 13% were in the formal public sector, and so on. One fascinating statistic is that of the formal public workers as of 1998, 8 years later in 2006, 82% were still employed in the formal public sector. So there is very little sectoral mobility. Once workers get a job in the formal public sector, they're guaranteed to have this job for a very long time. You might think that 8 years is not that much, but when we look at, when we compare the employment status between 1998 and 2012, 14 years apart, we see essentially the same statistics. So among formal private sector workers, formal public sector workers in 1998, 81% had the same sector of employment 14 years later. This is relevant to me personally because I've been in academia for 13 years, and now I'm switching jobs from a Korean university to working in Beirut at Ewha. So even for myself, I see myself switching sectors and world regions, but looking at these youth workers, 14 years later, they're still in the same sector, so they have very high job security. Looking at other types of workers, so in 1998, looking at the irregular wage workers or informal private sector workers, we see some fluidity, but only fluidity between similar types of workers. So among the irregular wage workers, some of them, in the following 8 years or 14 years, they might switch from irregular wage work to informal work or vice versa, but there's very little transition from irregular informal to formal private, to formal type of Well, looking at these figures, we might think that these are pretty historic figures. 1998 is a long time ago. Would we see different figures if we looked at more recent years? So comparing 2006 and 2012, we see very similar statistics. So in 2006, if you were if you were a youth, formal public sector worker, you have a 75% probability to remain in the formal public sector 6 years later, okay? Similarly, if you were in irregular or informal type of work, you are most likely to remain in that type of work 6 years later. Are there any changes between 98 through 2006 and here 2006 through 2012? There are some small changes. So it seems that formal public and formal private jobs are not as secure as they used to be between 98 and 2006. So here we have only, among formal private sector workers in 2006, only 44% remain in formal private sector by 2012. Among formal public, only 75% compared to 81 or 82% that we saw on the previous slide. And I think that these numbers are meaningful. I think we see some shift between informal, irregular versus formal types of jobs. So the formal sectors are becoming less secure, less different from informal employment. One other thing that we notice is that the share of irregular and informal sector work has increased between 98 through 2006 and 2006-2012. So I think, so in these figures we see some of the points that Ragiasa mentioned this morning. One, the irregular and informal type of work is becoming more prevalent. Between 98 and 2006 and 2006 to 2012, we already see that informal work became much more prevalent. Right here, if you used to be an irregular wage worker in 98, you had a 50% chance of remaining irregular or informal 8 years later. While in 2006, if you were an irregular worker, now you have a nearly 70% chance, 2/3 chance of remaining irregular or informal by 2012. Whether these numbers would continue by 2018, I believe so, but I would have to check. Okay, so well, one policy recommendation has been that to deal with the duality between formal and informal employment sectors would be to get them to merge together, to get the formal sector to absorb informal types of jobs. But maybe what this suggests that instead of the formal market absorbing informal jobs, maybe it's vice versa, that now informal jobs are spreading, formal employment is slowly kind of disappearing, and so it seems that it's more that informal economy is absorbing the formal economy, which may not be a good thing, which may mean that working conditions are deteriorating, and that's not the type of convergence that we would want. So I think that's one interesting message that that I speculate on. And another thing that I take from these figures is, well, if I was a youth worker in 1998 and my objective is to land a formal public or private job in the next 8 years, what is my strategy? Should I be searching for work? Should I stay out of the labor force and do other things, do some, go to private academies or travel around the world to learn languages or spend my time in other ways, invest in my human capital in some informal ways, or should I accept informal or irregular employment for the time being? What's the best strategy for me to eventually land the formal job? And according to, if we trust these numbers, one interpretation would be that the best strategy would be to stay out of labor force as of 1998. Okay? Because if I stay out of labor force and invest in my human capital in some informal ways, I have a, what's this, 30% chance of landing a formal job in the next 8 years. If I search for jobs, if I continue searching for formal employment, I only have a 20% chance, 19% chance of landing a formal job eventually. If I accept informal or irregular work, again, something like 20% chance. So the best strategy appears to be to stay out of labor force entirely and invest in my human capital in not through formal education or formal markets. Okay? That seems to change by 2006. And I'm not sure what to make of it, but at least that's something that I need to think about. If I was a youth worker in 2006 and I wanted to land a formal job in the next 6 years, should I stay unemployed and search for job actively? Should I accept some informal or irregular employment or be out of labor force? I should keep searching for formal jobs. Okay, now I have a 31% chance of landing a formal job if I keep searching, whereas if I stay out of labor force, my chances are 19%. Okay, so the strategy for youth workers might be changing over time. I'm curious what would happen by 2012 and 2018. Okay, so that's about job transitions. Just to say a little bit about the distribution of employment sectors in 2012 between men and women, comparing youth workers and non-youth workers, we see a lot of changes. So these are quite expected numbers, that youth workers don't get many formal jobs in the public sector. Most of them, if they get a job, they get irregular or informal job. As workers get older, there is a higher chance of having formal private, especially formal public employment. How would this change? How would this change by 2018? Probably formal public employment is less of an opportunity now than in 2012, but still remains an important prospect. How are things different for women? Especially, how are female young workers versus older workers different in their employment prospects? Not different at all. Okay, so for women, it's a lifelong problem. It's not a youth problem, it's a lifelong problem. So I think earlier today we heard that youth unemployment is a problem for men, but I think it's important to stress the contrary, that just for women, the problem is also there, except that it's a lifelong problem. It's not a youth problem, it's a lifelong big problem. Okay? Showing how do these employment prospects change over time? Again, these graphs show very expected results. That for men and women in 2006, the prospect of landing formal employment increases after the age of 30. Before the age of 30, very low prospect of having formal employment. Here I lump together formal private and formal public. And so we can say that up until the age of 26 or so, the chance of landing informal employment is much higher than the chance of landing formal employment. As of 2012, the situation deteriorated very much, right? Now, the chance of landing formal employment is much lower all the way to the age of 35, and much higher chance of landing informal employment. So in that sense, the conditions became much worse. How are things for women in 2006, 2012? Once again, we see a little bit of deterioration, that women had some prospect of having formal employment up to the age of something like 40, 45. Now they have, after 35 years of age, the prospect of formal employment disappears. And so even for women, we see some deterioration, but just the conditions were always very bad. Urban, rural, I can just point in one sentence that the conditions are worse for men in rural areas than in urban areas. For women, the only difference between these two figures is that the prospect of formal employment disappears by the time rural women reach the age of something like 32, 33 years of age. So by the time they get family, the prospects of formal employment effectively disappear. Okay, I'm out of time, so let me just say, okay, 2 minutes left. So what can we say more about female labor force participation rate? Well, this table shows the female labor force participation rate for a range of years for different countries and regions of the world. We see, again, we know that the rate for the Middle East and for Egypt are much lower than elsewhere in the world. One thing to notice is that during the financial crisis, in most of these world regions, the female labor force participation rate fell a little bit. Okay? In some regions, we see that the situation was improving. It temporarily fell during the crisis, and it started improving again. Or in other regions, it was declining. It declined fast during the crisis years, and then continued either declining or rising afterwards. But one thing, so this is related to the question of, there's a hypothesis that as economies develop, the female labor force participation rate should show a U-shaped pattern. That as the economy transitioned from agriculture to manufacturing to services, we should find female situation to become worse, but eventually start improving. So what this table adds to this discussion is that we have to account for temporary shocks, such as the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Okay, so we don't see a steady trend, but we see some temporary shocks that we would have to account for when testing the hypothesis. Let me stop right here. So I'll show one last. And 2 last sentences. I will say that, well, the prospects for the employment situation because of the 4th Industrial Revolution. There is a recent UN Ewha report as of August this year, and I just want to make reference to that report. Well, the report is, I think, kind of pessimistic that new technologies are being adopted and developed, but very gradually, very slowly. What will this new development eventually do to jobs? Well, it may not. This transition to new technology might get rid of jobs, but it will not get rid of work. To understand what will happen in different MENA region countries, we should look at how reliant, what is the composition of the economy, and what are the skills of labor force. we can make some positive and negative predictions about the job opportunities for men and for women as the economies transition to the new technology. Thank you very much.